So as we draw to a close with perhaps one of our most poignant and compelling messages about to be heard, I think back to last night's visit to the Freedom Center. How many of you went? Wasn't that amazing? I found myself welling up with emotion and passion and every emotion I could possibly feel last night as I walked through. And particularly as I walked from the history of slavery into the section called Invisible Slavery, I thought what a perfect way to characterize what we're all working on together in this equity movement of community schools. And you know, we've had an opportunity to hear from Chris Edley to talk about All Means All. We've had an opportunity to hear from all of the magnificent leadership in Cincinnati, elected officials, public school officials. We saw the Oakland students in their amazing video. We heard Randy Weingarten give just a punchy charge for community schools, national charge. We've heard from superintendents and mayors and senators, university leaders, and we were able to enjoy the generational bookends of Kent McGuire and David Johns yesterday, delivering similar but very, very unique messages on civil rights and on listening to the kids. We've seen countless awards for our amazing young leaders and emerging leaders and emerged leaders that have come out of the field. And we hope that it has sunk in what this is really about and what this equity message is really about. It's about to make sure that every child has every chance every day. So as I introduce our closing speaker, his full bio is in your program. I'd just like to say that one can hardly find a person that has done more to liberate, to create access, and to provide civil rights for as many, contemporary civil rights for the unbelievable hundreds and thousands who still struggle to find their place in the voter line as the Reverend Dr. William Barber. Some things that I'll say about him this morning. He's the president of the North Carolina State Conference of the NAACP, and he was re-elected national board member in 2011. He was appointed as the national NAACP chair of the Legislative Political Action Committee, and under his leadership, the NAACP developed a new 21st century voter registration, voter participation system. It baffles the mind that on the anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act, which was yesterday, that we still have this struggle. That there are still people who've been entitled to vote for years who have never stepped into a voting booth because of the invisible slavery that still exists. So as I welcome the Right Reverend Dr. William Barber, we have a video to cue up so that you can see a little bit more about his work, and then he will give you your final charge to go forth and do what you know in your heart and in your mind and in your belly is right. So let's cue the video, and then I'll welcome Dr. Barber.
This is the most multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic gathering in the South.
They said, we have power, we're going to engage in political tyranny, and this legislature has had a propensity to pass laws that the courts of the state, didn't even have to get to the federal court, the courts of the state overturned. So we have the moral high ground. They're the ones that should be questioned.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Dr. Barber will speak to you.
I'm afraid Dr. Barber needs to get to my office so we can set up an appointment. No. All we need to do is just be respectful towards each other.
Forward, together, not one step back. Not one step back. When blacks and progressive whites came together 144 years ago to begin the long journey out of the divisions of the Civil War, The good of the whole was their vision and their dream for this state. They knew then what we must know now. It's the only way forward. It's the better way.
The battle today is not between the Democrats and the Republicans. It is between those who believe in a philosophy of greed and selfishness and those who believe in the morality of caring for those in need.
Now is the time to take a stand for justice throughout this land.
The policies of Tom Tillis, Phil Berger, and Pat McCrory are harming my patients grievously.
There are constitutional rights that must be supported in this state.
Our governor and legislators are trying to steal our birthright as citizens. But together we say you cannot have our state.
An attack on voting rights is an attack on the soul of our democracy.
But there's nothing wrong with North Carolina that is good, so people power cannot fix.
I'm a teacher. I drove 6 hours this morning. I was so depressed when I heard what this legislature thinks of me. But I came last week and I was inspired, and I'll come as often as I need to.
We will stand up again. We will march again. We will preach again. We will organize again. We are black. We are white. We are Latino. We are Native American. We are Democrat. We are Republican. We are independent. We are people of faith. We are people not of faith. We are natives and immigrants. We are business leaders and workers and unemployed. We are doctors and the uninsured. We are gay. We are straight. We are students. We are parents. We are retirees. We are North Carolina. We are America. And we're here. And we ain't going nowhere.
Ladies and gentlemen, whatever your faith in God or the universe, welcome with me the Right Reverend Dr. William Barber.
I'm good. Good morning. It is good to be with you here today, and I'm so privileged and humble to gather in this place with you. I want to thank my sister for such a gracious introduction, and I greet you on behalf of the thousands upon thousands of devotees of the Forward Together Moral Monday movement that not only is in North Carolina, but has spread in the spirit of it has spread in other parts of the country. To President Marty Blank, will we give him a hand? Where's Marty? He's in the back. Give him a hand. And to our president here in Cincinnati, Darlene Carmine, is she here? Where is she? I'm looking for them. They're around. And I'm always thankful for the persons who get us here and the person you're all going to have to blame if you don't like what I say, and that's Miss Shaw of AFT. Where's Miss Shaw? She said don't call her name, but that's who you blame right there. 38 states, I understand. 5 countries. People from everywhere. I want to suggest to you today, as you go back, as Dr. King said, whenever we come together, the issue is what do we do when we go back? You remember the March on Washington? He said, go back to Alabama, go back to Mississippi. And I want to suggest to you that we need a pathway to higher ground in our country's current political and social atmosphere. And I want to suggest to you that the only way to that higher ground are 3 things, and sometimes I use, though I know there are many different organizations, but I often use AFT's symbol to talk. We must assess where we are. Say that, assess where we are. We must fight back now. Say that. We must fight back now, and we must stand together. Say we must stand together. Anytime you are in a historical moment, you must know where you are. Dr. King said one of the greatest tragedies is to be like Rip Van Winkle and go to sleep during a revolution. In my own spiritual tradition, I'm a Christian, but my Jewish friends would tell you in the Old Testament there was a word that once came to a lady who had gained access to the palace, and it said, maybe you were born for such a time as this. So where are we? We're 50 years after the war on poverty. There was a time when there was some community moral commitment to lift up the poor and the marginalized. There was a time, for a brief shining moment, that we recognized we were inextricably bound together. In that moment, the war on poverty, some of you remember, it included Head Start, Medicaid, Medicare, expansion of Social Security, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, federal funding for K through 12, and Pell Grants for higher education, and there was a time those programs enjoyed pretty broad public support. Russell Sage, a scholar, says that of the War on Poverty program that you could look at them in three lenses. The first part was a commitment to real community that understood that if you want real community, you have to boost wages through education and job training. The second was to provide income support, particularly for single mothers and the elderly. And the third was to bring a system of government health care to the elderly and the poor. There was a time, for a brief shining moment, that we wrestled with this issue of equity in the richest country in the world. And contrary to some extremist claims, the war on poverty did reduce the amount and the severity of poverty in the United States. You take child poverty, for instance, it would be much greater if it hadn't been for food stamps. But not only did it reduce hunger, the research finds that the food stamps program made children healthier as adults and women and more likely to be economically sufficient. And children where the families were able at least to get some form of subsistence despite their poverty were less likely to be victims of abuse, neglect, or suffer from developmental disability. There was a time, for a brief shining moment, that we didn't feel like you had to make welfare an ugly word, especially since it found its way in the preamble of our Constitution. One of our greatest calls in our Constitution, before you ever get to freedom, is to establish justice, to provide for the common defense, and to promote the general welfare. During those days, the poverty rate for people 65 years and older was 35% in 1959, compared to 17% of non-elderly households. So nearly 20% of Americans were poor at the beginning of the poverty, and 35% of those over 65. Now, the poverty rate for the elderly is 9%, lower than the rate of non-elderly households, says Sage. And this was largely the result of dramatic increases in Social Security, along with health care provided through Medicare. Now, these programs were not perfect. For instance, most people, my grandmother, African Americans, and many women were not able to access Social Security early on because Roosevelt had to cut a deal with Southern senators, and that deal was, we don't want African Americans and Latinos to have access to Social Security, and so they made it so that in the first rendition of it, if you were in an agrarian or a domestic world working, you did not get access and you weren't able to pay in until 1954. But even with that deficiency, the programs tried to address the issue of equity. And let us not forget that institutional racism was and still is a real issue. And one of the things we forget about the war on poverty was its linkages with the civil rights movement. For instance, I don't know if you remember, but Medicaid and Medicare funds were withheld from hospitals if they didn't comply with the Civil Rights Act. And because of that, that in turn led to the desegregation of Southern hospitals and a drop in black infant mortality rates. These efforts made a difference 50 years ago. We also know that the war on poverty was surrendered, it was not won. Programs that once celebrated in some ways this attempt to address the issue of equity by multiple segments of our community, as Tim Wise said, were racialized and demonized and caused even many poor whites, particularly in the South, to begin to vote for politicians that were against their own self-interest. Where are we? 50 years later, even a Republican like Kasich of Ohio, in a brief epiphany of honesty, had to admit that elements of his party now were engaged in a war on the poor because they refused to expand Medicaid. So 50 years later, it is troubling that as Otto Swammer, who I had a moment to study with at MIT, who's an economics professor, says, we now commit attention violence against the poor. The opposite to the war on poverty, where we focused on the poor, was that we drove the poor into hiding. We took the language poor out of our repertoire in public discourse. Even President Obama has had to struggle with that issue because often he'll say that he's developing programs for those who are trying to make their way into the middle class. But we need a conversation that can say some folk are not trying to make their way in the middle class, they're just trying to live to the next day. And we see this attention violence, particularly if you look at, for instance, Representative Ryan recently said in his faulty report that poverty programs give the poor a hammock to lay in. That's always interesting to me, somebody that's getting their salary from the people that thinks when the people get a salary, it makes them lazy. In other words, what he's saying is that helping the poor by giving minimum wages makes them lazy. Helping the poor with unemployment makes them lazy. Helping the poor with health insurance makes them lazy. Helping the poor with food stamps makes them lazy. Helping the poor have access to education makes them lazy. So his argument, this is his focus of community and those that think like Tim. If you want to help the poor, cut programs. This is his idea of community. Give more. If you really want to help the poor, you just give more tax cuts to the wealthy, and the wealthy will allow a little crumbs. You know, I have a problem with that because there's a story in the Bible about this rich guy now named Dives. And he wouldn't even allow Lazarus, a poor man, to even eat the crumbs. Their idea of community is take services and make people get up to work. His idea is that despite the fact that most poor are working poor, the way you help the poor, his idea of community is don't support living wages. Don't support minimum wages. You know, Dr. King said that idea of community, he said this 50-some, almost 49 years ago, Dr. King said that kind of approach to community is not community, it is chaos. And he wrote a little book called Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Where are we? Here we are 60 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, 60 years after Thurgood Marshall argued the only way this court can decide this case in opposition to our position is that there must be some reason which gives the state the right to make classification that they can make in regard to nothing else but regard to Negroes. And if you make that case in this court, Thurgood said, then you are arguing that Negroes are inferior to all other human beings. Don't let it be lost on you that May is the 60th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of decision. And don't let it be lost on you that Charles and David Koch's daddy, Freddie Koch, from where they get their money, the money they've inherited, and the philosophy they inherited comes from the philosophy of the John Birch Society. And that idea of community was they were against the Brown decision, they were against civil rights, and they called for the impeachment of Earl Warren upon his signing off on a 9-0 decision. So in essence, where are we, Charles and David Koch, 60 years after Brown, and the dream of equity are still trying to force their father's nightmare on America. Don't ever forget. Don't forget that it was in New York, not in the South, that the first riot was held after the Brown decision. Here we are, 100 years after public education school systems were set up in America. Here we are after Thomas Jefferson argued that the newly independent nation needed an educational system, and he suggested tax dollars to fund it. Here we are 146 years after the first Reconstruction began in 1868, when black and white fusion Reconstruction politicians came together. And in my state of North Carolina, when they wrote the Constitution after slavery, they guaranteed public education as a constitutional right. We don't even have that in the federal Constitution, but in 1868, there were white and black politicians all over the South that understood if you're going to build community, public education must be a constitutional right. Here we are 60 years after President Eisenhower, a Republican, declared that public education was a matter of national defense. And yet when we assess where we are in history, we're also at the same time in a time of extremist right-wingers who are feverishly working to take public school money and give it to private schools. All of this history behind us, and yet we have those who want to go backwards. Resegregation is at an all-time high. Teachers are devalued. Teachers' unions are attacked. And even though we know what works, we know how to fix our public education system. Stop resegregation and promote diversity. Provide equity and funding for all schools. Provide and fund high-quality teachers in smaller classrooms and union rights. Provide high-quality leadership teams. Provide high-quality facilities and support staff. Focus on math, science, reading, and history. Support parental and community involvement, and address the unjust and disproportionate suspensions and reduce out rates and increase graduation rates among African American, the poor, and other minority students. We know what works, but the question is having the will to work what works. We are in a time when the far-right extremists will simply do anything also to delegitimize anybody that wants to move forward, and because what you see, that's what they are doing when they attack, for instance, the president. Now, I don't agree with the president on everything, neither does the NAACP, but some of us understand why every now and then you have to get a brother a break. Eric Holder was right just a day or so ago when he talked about the unprecedented attacks and the level of attack. Think about it. The time we're in, on the one hand, we're in a moment we've never seen in American history. An African American in the White House, little black girls having pajama parties in a White House that was built by slaves. That in itself. And yet, in that very same space, we see hate crimes going up and hate groups going up. And these vicious attacks. You know, they claim he wasn't born here. Because as one scholar says, that the extremists always like to make you something other than an American. Then they claimed he was too small for the president, not in size, but in mental intellect. Huh? I mean, he graduated from Harvard, they had Sarah Palin, but he's too small, come on. They claimed he's the cause of economic problems, not that he's trying to fix what stemmed from the Bush administration. I never will forget when we were in a place where Mayberry was filmed. It's called, Mount Airy, North Carolina. We were having a poverty tour up there, And while we were there, black and white together, talking about the face of poverty, across the street there were these Tea Party extremists in front of a factory that had closed. And they had a sign up said, "This is the result of Obama." So I went over because I just like to know, I like to meet smart people, and I wanted to, if you got the evidence, I want to know it. So I went over, they told me not to, and I said no, and I went over, I said, well, will you explain to me? I said, when did the factory close? They said 2006. I said, wait a minute now, the factory closed in 2006, and you claim that that's President Obama's fault, and he didn't take office, wasn't elected till 2008? And I just stopped for a minute. They said, that's right. I said, well, if that's true, you need to really support him because he's some kind of super president. He can go back in time and create policies before he even gets in office. And now, you notice the next line. You got to watch this stuff because this language is, you laugh, but it's dangerous. Now, when he exercises the constitutional right of executive orders, which all presidents have and all presidents are using, they claim he's breaking the law. This completes their racist coding. Listen, here's how it goes when you break it down to street level. He's not one of us. He's not born here. He's not an American. He's an outsider. He's a socialist. He's not intelligent enough. And on top of that, he's a lawless thug. That's where we are. We live in a time when 100 years after Teddy Roosevelt first declared that living wages, minimum wages, and health care and protecting the environment were all moral issues. But 100 years later, minimum wages are under attack, living wages are under attack, labor is under attack, and instead of the morals of Teddy Roosevelt, we are seeing the extremism of the Tea Party. Now, I did not lay out this assessment for us to be morbid or to be distressed. But I come to you to understand that you must understand where you are in history in order to understand what you must do in history. Actually, I come to suggest to you that if there are those fighting against our idea of community this hard, it must mean we're right, and it must mean we need to re-engage and not disengage. See, I come from a tradition that says, blessed are you when men persecute you and revile you and say all manner of wickedness against you. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad. The fight, your enemy sometimes is your best friend because your enemy helps you to clarify what you're supposed to be doing with the few moments of breath and life that you have in this existence. And so, number two, I believe not only must we assess where we are, we must fight back now. Say fight back now. We must fight any and every mean and extreme attempt to promote policies that take us backwards. And you know, we need to get to the place where we're not so formal and so erudite in exposing what extremism really is trying to push. And notice I'm not saying Republican, Democrat, I'm talking about extremism. Because I know some good Republicans. My granddaddy was one. Lincoln was one. Even Ronald Reagan, when he passed earned income tax credit, was right. And anytime you have a group of people so extreme they can make Ronald Reagan look like a liberal, somebody better fight back now. So we must unpack, because here's the whole message of extremism. Here's the whole message. Their argument is the way we, the people, get to a more perfect society is you deny education, you deny health care, you deny unemployment, you deny minimum wage, you deny women's rights, you deny LGBT rights, you deny immigrant rights, you deny labor rights, and if you really want a great America, give more tax cuts to the wealthy and be sure to give everybody a gun. That's their entire agenda. And we must fight back and push forward. But our fight back can't be partisan. We must have a fight back that is rooted in a moral narrative of moral dissent. We must rise to higher ground. You see, I was coming across the bridge last night and I was reminded, I don't know what his party was, but I do know that there's a Kentucky justice from the 1800s. He was a justice in the Supreme Court named John Marshall Harlan. And they called John Marshall Harlan the great dissenter. They didn't call him Republican or Democrat. They called him the great dissenter because he would stand on some principles. Didn't matter who his friends were. He didn't win all the time, but he fought. He fought, he raised moral dissent, and because he fought, he laid the groundwork for future victories. If Harlan, Justice Harlan, had not dissented in the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896, the only justice, white, from Kentucky, he said it's wrong. He said, listen, there is no caste system here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law. That's equity. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The arbitrary separation of citizens based on race, while they are not on a public highway, is a badge of servitude wholly inconsistent with the civil freedom and the equality before the law established by this Constitution. He stood and said, I'll stand here if I got to stand by myself. And because he stood, he provided the legal angles later for Thurgood Marshall to take on Plessy versus Ferguson. In fact, Thurgood Marshall said, they asked him, is your greatest admiration to Justice Warren, who signed the Brown versus Board of Education decision? Justice Marshall said, no. He did a great thing, Justice Marshall did, Justice Warren did, but he was signing a 9-0 victory. He said, my greatest admiration goes to Harlan, because Harlan was a solitary and lonely figure writing for posterity. Could it be, you all, that whether or not we fight back now will determine what people do generations from now? Could it be that all of us who are activists need to stop worrying about who has the majority vote and start doing and demanding what is morally right and fight back now? This is no time to be depressed when you know what community looks like, when you know what democracy looks like. Frederick Douglass once says, those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without the plowing of the ground, who want rain without the thunder and the lightning, who want the ocean without the roar of its many words. This struggle may be a moral one or a physical one. It may be both, but it must be a struggle. If Frederick Douglass could stand up against slavery, who in the hell is scared of the Tea Party? Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, come on, y'all. This is no time for us to cower down and stay within the comfort zone of hotels. Yes, come to the Western, but when you go back, you better get in the street and get in the boardrooms and get in the ballot box. Henry David Thoreau once said when his friend Ralph Waldo Emerson came and visited him, Mr. Shaw, in jail one night for civil disobedience, he said, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Henry said, Ralph, what are you doing out there in the face of such injustice? And then somebody said, Henry, are you going to apologize and repent for your actions of civil disobedience? He said, if I repent of anything, it's very likely that I will repent of my good behavior, because I wonder what demon possessed me that I behaved so well in the face of injustice. Touch your neighbor and say, it's time to act up a little bit. It's time to stand up a little bit. It's time to speak up. Langston Hughes put it like this: oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been and yet must be, the land where every man's free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, the Indians, the Negro, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain. We must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me an ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear by this oath, America will be. It's time to fight, y'all. You all went to the Freedom Museum last night, but be reminded when the abolitionists started fighting, they weren't in the majority. Be reminded that they weren't comfortable just when they had politicians they could go to and could win a vote. There was no vote. But the abolitionists started. They believed they were right. They created the Underground Railroad. Some say they came across yonder river, but there is also a story that they were so committed to freedom that some of them dug a tunnel up under the river. You know what kind of faith you have to dig a tunnel in the 1800s up under a river and believe it's going to hold? But there are some values of our community that are so pure, that are so right, you ought to be willing to fight for it if it costs you your everything in your life. And educating our children and lifting community and providing equity for everybody is one of those fights. And the reason why we need the fight with a moral narrative is you can't compromise with extremism. You know, I get scared of this thing that we got to compromise. See, when extremism tries to get you to compromise, this is what they do. They go so far extreme, and then they put someone up that's a little more moderate extreme, and if you compromise with that, you're still in. So one of the things we've got to work toward is fight to change the questions that are asked in an attempt to shape public policy. We have to change the language, the discourse, and shift the center of gravity. Let me share with you what I mean. In the early days of this country, a question was raised like this: how shall we treat the slaves as it relates to property taxes? The wrong question. And the abolitionists, see, they wouldn't deal with that question. It was a political question. The abolitionist says, no, there's a higher ground. The question is not how do we deal with the slave according to property taxes. The question is, how do we get rid of slavery? Because if you deal with the wrong question, you end up with something like the 3/5 compromise, where you relegate people to fragments and fractions. And so we have to have a movement from advocates like you and me that changes the center of gravity and changes the very conversation. During the Montgomery movement, there were some that wanted Dr. King to fight for, listen, a kinder, gentler segregation. And Dr. King almost did. He was the new kid in town. It was an old man, E.D. Nixon, that had fought for America. He was an old NAACP, and he was rough. And he said, Dr. King, I didn't come out here to join with you to fight for a more kinder form of segregation. And he said, no, we must use our energy to end segregation. That is the question. Not how to get a kinder form of segregation, but how to end it. Now, let's move to our time. There are those who want to sucker us into asking this question, like, how can we fund public education within the current tax revenue? You can't. Not like it should be, and it never has been. And you sure can't engage in that discussion with people who robbed the bank and then say the bank doesn't have any money. Yeah, you can't. If you play their game, you lose. So what we have to do is we have to fight to change how to debate the issue of public education that lines up with our constitutional and moral value to promote the general fair. The question is, how does investing in education build the minds and the potential of young people, and how does investment in education fuel the prospect of higher education, and how does investment in education fuel our economy, and how does public education line up with our deepest moral values, and how, if we don't fund public education, we literally take this nation down in the dumps. Those are the questions we must demand are wrestled with. Here's another one. You know, the Supreme Court had this debacle. They voted wrong. 5 of them voted to end the formula, Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act. And now it's in the Congress. And it's interesting what people are saying. They're saying, well, what we've got to figure out now is how to compromise. So here's the bill that's currently before the Congress. And all of you from these 38 states, I want you to hear me, because you need to understand what's going on, and you need to go back. If you're concerned about education, you better get in the game to fight for a Voting Rights Act amendment that doesn't give us less protection than we had 49 years ago after the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge, because that's about what we're getting ready to have. And not just our friends, people you claim are your political friend, but people are compromising on sacred principles. Now here's how it goes. They are saying we got to fix the formula to choose how states are included. But we got to compromise because the Tea Party is so strong. So one of the compromises goes like this. Let's include Ohio, and y'all need to be included, God knows, with the stuff that they're trying to do up here and trying to stop people from voting, because that's the only way narrow-minded extremists can win. They can't win if everybody votes. So so you may have heard that Ohio is now included. But the trade-off for that is to leave Alabama, North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and Tennessee unincluded. Oh, yeah, you got to read the whole book, baby. The trick is to get you all excited up here that Ohio is finally included under pre-clearance. But if you include Ohio in pre-clearance and then remove pre-clearance from 6 southern states, if you remove pre-clearance from North Carolina, where the worst voter suppression bill is now law that we're fighting right now in the courts, then you might gain in Ohio, but you're going to lose in the South. Therefore, you're going to lose in the nation. So the issue ought to be, those of you in Ohio ought to be fighting and telling your congressman, you better get North Carolina in, you better get Alabama in, and we in North Carolina ought to be saying, you better keep Ohio in, you better keep Ohio in, because unless, as Dr. King said, we learn how to live together as people, we're going to perish together as fools. That's true socially, and that's true politically. Touch your neighbor and say, we got to fight back. Julian Bond says it like this: you don't ever negotiate until you fight. And the reason I showed that, and I'm almost through, the reason I showed that video is I come here to tell you it is possible to change the terms of the battle and to shift the center of gravity. Moral Monday in North Carolina is proof. Many of you have heard that down in North Carolina, my brother here, he was there, and Randy was there with us and others. Thousands have organized. On February the 8th, Randy Weingarten was with us and other educators, NCEA and others, when nearly 100,000 people gathered in the South, in the capital. More people than gathered on the Edmunds-Pettus Bridge 49 years ago, to bring attention to this extremism. Because we understand that when you fight this kind of extremism, like the Koch brother legacy, you've got to have a mobilization that's not partisan. What we need now, 38 states, we need state-based movements. That's what ALEC learned. ALEC went down to the states. The Tea Party went down to the state. They said if we take over state legislature, we can control the Congress and we can nullify the president. Now what we need are indigenously led, homegrown leadership. Nobody can fly into your state and helicopter in, have a big rally and change your state. We need homegrown leadership. State-based leadership that focuses on state government, state legislatures, and state governors, and a movement that is deeply moral and deeply constitutional, and it must be anti-racism and anti-poverty and pro-justice and pro-labor, and it must be transformative coalition, not transactional coalition, and it must be a fusion movement that makes room for everybody. And so, on that day when we gathered, we've had now 114 Moral Monday events, but we tell them all the time, we're black, we're white, we're Latino, we're Native American, we're Democrat, we're Republican, we're independent, we're people of faith, we're people not of faith, we're people who are secular, who believe in a moral universe, we are people, we are Native, we are immigrants, we are business leaders, we are workers, we are unemployed, we are doctors, we are uninsured, we are gay, we are straight, we are students, we are parents, we are retirees, we are America. And when we started this movement to challenge extremism, we've seen Republicans come out. We had a Republican chair from a county that's 89% Republican say, I'm not with this Tea Party extremism, and join the movement. Because when you fight based on the moral fabric of society, it makes room. And so and then the other thing we have to fight, we've got to challenge, I'm a preacher, we've got to challenge the position of the religious right. I'm just about sick of the religious right constantly suggesting the only issues of morality are prayer in the school, homosexualities, and abortion. First of all, there are no scriptures in the Bible about prayer in the school. Secondly, the other issues that are raised, while there may be a couple of scriptures, that most of them they misinterpret. Secondly, those issues are between you, your God, your priest, or your pastor. And thirdly, not one scripture in the Bible gives you the license to hate anybody or to take anybody's rights. And so our movement, Moral, it challenges the heresy of the religious right. And what we do is we say, listen, tell you want a moral debate, bring it on, because we're going to bring up Isaiah 10, woe unto those who rob the poor of their right. You want a moral debate? Come on, bring it on. We're going to bring up the Micah, which says, what doth the Lord require but that you do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God? You want a moral debate? Come on. We're going to teach you the Bible since you act like you don't know it. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you come visit me? And then we need a movement that's not rooted in fear, but rooted in hope. We need to know what we're fighting for. We must, if we want real community, secure pro-labor, anti-poverty policies. We must have educational equality for every child. We must have health care for all and ensure environmental protection. We must have fairness in the criminal justice system. And we must protect and expand voting rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, immigrant rights, and the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. Now let me conclude. When we started, they wanted to debate about what was available in the budget. And even some of our education friends thought that they could negotiate with extremists, and then the legislature cut another $1 billion from public education, took teacher tenure, took $10 million of public education money, tried to give it to private schools, and basically said, you all take that. So then we got together. And we said, this is not about Democrat or Republican, it's about whether we're going to take the low road to political destruction or the high road to higher ground. Now, I will tell you, they first laughed at us. When the first 17 of us got arrested, they laughed at us. But then the next Monday, 34 showed up. The next Monday, 68. By the end of the summer, 25,000 people, 945 people got arrested of all different races, creeds, colors, incomes, and parties. They even put the leaders of our teachers union in jail. And one of them, Rodney Ellis, said, I'm taking my toothbrush because I'm going to jail, and it's all right, but I'm standing up. But then after we stayed steadfast, because extremists are not afraid of you having a conference. They're not afraid of you having one rally. But when you can do it consistently, after week 1, then week 2, then they began to see our potential. The more we fought, they got harder, but then every major editorial in the state started saying their attack on public education is wrong. Their attacks on our fundamental rights are wrong. A judge heard our moral and legal fight, and he ordered an injunction against their monies that they're going to give to private schools. And when we started fighting, the governor was at 50% in the poll. Now he's under 30 and dropping. When we started, the legislature was at 40% in the poll. Now they're under 19 and dropping. We haven't won yet, but I tell you, there are signs. Now, all of a sudden, the governor wants to meet with the teachers union. You hear what I'm saying? Now, all of a sudden, they're trying to talk about expanding Medicaid, because just last week, I stood with a Republican mayor in a city whose hospital is being closed, and we are now joining forces together saying that Medicaid expansion is not a Republican issue or a Democrat issue, it's a moral issue. So as I close today, tell your neighbor, we must stay together. Say we must stay together. Not only must we assess where we are, not only must we fight now, we must fight together. And I want you to know that when we fight together, that's when we have power. We need movements that understand intersectionality. I want you to say that 3 times. Say intersectionality. 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 What that means is it's not just educators fighting for education and LGBT fighting for gay rights. No, what we need are education advocates fighting for LGBT rights, and labor advocates fighting for education rights, and health advocates fighting for criminal rights, justice rights, and immigrant advocates fighting for women's rights. In other words, we need all of us fighting for each other's issues, because the other side is unified. So if we're not unified, they don't have the problem, we have the problem. We got to come together like they did in the 1800s in the first Reconstruction. We got to come together like they did in the Civil Rights Movement. It's true today. If we stay together, if we vote together, if we organize together, and if we even go to jail together, we can take on these extremists. If we stay together, we can turn them back. Their entire vision takes us down the low road. But it's time for us to move this nation to higher ground, where every child is educated, higher ground, where the sick receive health care and they are healed, higher ground where the poor are lifted up and not pushed down, higher ground where voting rights are secure for everyone, higher ground where we are truly one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, higher ground, a nation where not only do we sing America, America, God shed his grace on you, but we show grace to immigrants, and grace to our gay brothers and sisters, and grace to our children, and grace to women, higher ground where the powerful seek to be served and not to be served. You know, out in the wild, elephants, when they feel an attack, they form a circle. And they put the children in the middle of the circle and they fight together. I declare we can't let the elephants in the wild have more sense than us in America. Y'all hear what I'm saying? Things happen when you come together. When hydrogen and oxygen come together, then you get water. I flew out here on a big jet. But in order to make the flight, the plane had to stay together. The wings couldn't take off from D.C. and go to Cincinnati and leave the engine. We got to stay together. And it's still true, divided we fall, but together we stand. When young people 50 years ago started Freedom Summer, they were told they couldn't make a difference, but they went to the South and they stayed together. Some of them died, but they changed America. Somebody ought to not only sing Al Green's song, you ought to make it the mantra of a new movement. Let us stay together, loving you, whether good times are good or bad, happy or sad. It's time for us to stay together. I'm a preacher, so let me close here. When Moses and his rod got together, they were able to bring Pharaoh down. I wish I had some help somewhere. When David and his stones got together, he was able to bring Goliath down. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stayed together, they were able to change domination. When 120 disciples got on one accord, then the Spirit of the Lord lifted them to be on a mission. When Sojourner Truth got together with Miss Staten, women were able to fight for the right to vote. When some years ago, let me tell you, I know what staying together will do for you. First of all, because I'm the result of staying together. Y'all look up in here, you know I'm not just black, I'm Native American, and I'm white. But when you put it all together, Lord have mercy, Jesus. I came up here on a cane, and some of y'all said to me, you said, Reverend Barber, are you all right? I'm all right. What you don't know about that cane is my testimony. Because a few years ago, they said I'd never walk again. A few years ago, they said I had a disease that was crippling me. But when my mind and my faith and my doctor and my swim coach got it all together, look at what the Lord can do. Let's stay together.
Let's stay together. If you stay together, the moral arc of the universe bends toward justice. If you stay together, they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. If you stay together, one can chase 1,000 and two can put 10,000 to flight. If you stay together, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. If you stay together, ain't nobody gonna turn us around. If you stay together, this land is your land. This land is my land. Let's stay together and take this nation from the low ground to higher ground. It's time for all of us to stay together. Stay together. Stay together. We win. Stay together. If God be for you, doesn't matter if the whole world is against you. Turn to your neighbor and stay together. Say, stay together. Tell them it's fighting time. Tell them stay together. Now slap somebody a high five. Slap somebody a high five. Come on here. Now grab somebody by the hand. Grab them by the hand and say, if Reverend Barber can jump with a bad hip that they said he couldn't ever work, come on in here, let's jump. Let's stay together. Let's stay together. Let's stay together. And keep your eyes .
When I say hold on, you say hold on. When I say hold on, you say hold on. And we all say keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Are you ready? Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Well, there's one thing that we did wrong. We stayed in the wilderness a little too long. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. But here's one thing I know we did right. We started to fight for our equal rights. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on. Hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Well, the only chain that man can stand is the chain of a hand in hand. Keep your eyes on the prize, hold on. Hold on, hold on. Keep your eyes on the prize.